A Tale of the Ragged Mountains. During the fall of the year 1827, while residing near Charlottesville, Virginia, I casually made the acquaintance of Mr. Augustus Bedloe. This young gentleman was remarkable in every respect, and excited in me a profound interest and curiosity. I found it impossible to comprehend him either in his moral or his physical relations. Of his family I could obtain no satisfactory account. Whence he came, I never ascertained. Even about his age, although I called him a young gentleman, there was something which perplexed me in no little degree. He certainly seemed young, and he made a point of speaking about his youth. Yet there were moments when I should have had little trouble in imagining him 100 years of age. But in no regard was he more peculiar than in his personal appearance. He was singularly tall and thin. He stooped much. His limbs were exceedingly long and emaciated. His forehead was broad and low. His complexion was absolutely bloodless. His mouth was large and flexible, and his teeth were more wildly uneven, although sound, than I had ever before seen teeth in a human head. The expression of his smile, however, was by no means unpleasing, as might be supposed, but it had no variation whatsoever. It was one of profound melancholy, of a faceless and unceasing gloom. His eyes were abnormally large, and round like those of a cat. The pupils, too, upon any accession or diminution of light, underwent contraction or dilation, just such as is observed in the feline tribe. In moments of excitement the orbs grew bright to a degree almost inconceivable, seeming to emit luminous rays, not of a reflected, but of an intrinsic lustre, as does a candle or the sun. Yet their ordinary condition was so totally vapid, filmy, and dull, as to convey the idea of the eyes of a long-interred corpse. These peculiarities of person appeared to cause him much annoyance, and he was continually alluding to them in a sort of half-explanatory, half-apologetic strain, which, when I first heard it, impressed me very painfully. I soon, however, grew accustomed to it, and my uneasiness wore off. It seemed to be his design rather to insinuate than directly to assert that, physically, he had not always been what he was, that a long series of neuralgic attacks had reduced him from a condition of more than usual personal beauty to that which I saw. For many years past he had been attended by a physician named Templeton, an old gentleman, perhaps 70 years of age, whom he had first encountered at Saratoga, and from whose attention, while there, he either received or fancied that he received great benefit. The result was that Bedloe, who was wealthy, had made an arrangement with Dr. Templeton, by which the latter, in consideration of a liberal annual allowance, had consented to devote his time and medical experience exclusively to the care of the invalid. Dr. Templeton had been a traveller in his younger days, and at Paris had become a convert in great measure to the doctrines of Mesmer. It was altogether by means of magnetic remedies that he had succeeded in alleviating the acute pains of his patient, and this success had very naturally inspired the latter with a certain degree of confidence in the opinions from which the remedies had been educed. The doctor, however, like all enthusiasts, had struggled hard to make a thorough convert of his pupil, and finally so far gained his point as to induce the sufferer to submit to numerous experiments. By a frequent repetition of these, a result had arisen, which of late days had become so common as to attract little or no attention, but which, at the period of which I write, had very rarely been known in America. I mean to say that between Dr. Templeton and Bedloe there had grown up, little by little, a very distinct and strongly marked rapport or magnetic relation. I am not prepared to assert, however, that this rapport extended beyond the limits of the simple sleep-producing power, but this power itself had attained great intensity. At the first attempt to induce the magnetic somnolency, the mesmerist entirely failed. In the fifth or sixth he succeeded very partially, and after long continued effort. Only at the 12th was the triumph complete. After this, the will of the patient succumbed rapidly to that of the physician, so that, when I first became acquainted with the two, sleep was brought about almost instantaneously by the mere volition of the operator, even when the invalid was unaware of his presence. It is only now, in the year 1845, when similar miracles are witnessed daily by thousands, that I dare venture to record this apparent impossibility as a matter of serious fact. The temperature of Bedloe was, in the highest degree, sensitive, excitable, enthusiastic. His imagination was singularly vigorous and creative, and no doubt it derived additional force from the habitual use of morphine, which he swallowed in great quantity, and without which he would have found it impossible to exist. It was his practice to take a very large dose of it immediately after breakfast each morning, or rather immediately after a cup of strong coffee, for he ate nothing in the forenoon, and then set forth alone, or attended only by a dog, upon a long ramble among the chain of wild and dreary hills that lie westward and southward of Charlottesville, and are there dignified by the title of the Ragged Mountains. Upon a dim, warm, misty day, toward the close of November, and during the strange interregnum of the seasons which in America is termed the Indian summer, Mr. Bedloe departed as usual for the hills. The day passed, and still he did not return. About 8 o'clock at night, having become seriously alarmed at his protracted absence, we were about setting out in search of him, when he unexpectedly made his appearance, in health no worse than usual, and in rather more than ordinary spirits. The account which he gave of his expedition, and of the events which had detained him, was a singular one indeed. "You will remember," said he, "that it was about 9 in the morning when I left Charlottesville. I bent my steps immediately to the mountains, and about 10 entered a gorge which was entirely new to me. I followed the windings of this pass with much interest. The scenery which presented itself on all sides, although scarcely entitled to be called grand, had about it an indescribable and to me a delicious aspect of dreary desolation. The solitude seemed absolutely virgin. I could not help believing that the green sods and the grey rocks upon which I trod had been trodden never before by the foot of a human being. So entirely secluded, and in fact inaccessible except through a series of accidents, is the entrance of the ravine, that it is by no means impossible that I was indeed the first adventurer, the very first and sole adventurer who had ever penetrated its recesses. The thick and peculiar mist or smoke which distinguishes the Indian summer, and which now hung heavily over all objects, served no doubt to deepen the vague impressions which these objects created. So dense was this pleasant fog that I could at no time see more than a dozen yards of the path before me. This path was excessively sinuous, and as the sun could not be seen, I soon lost all idea of the direction in which I journeyed. In the meantime the morphine had its customary effect, that of enduing all the external world with an intensity of interest. In the quivering of a leaf, in the hue of a blade of grass, in the shape of a trefoil, in the humming of a bee, in the gleaming of a dewdrop, in the breathing of the wind, in the faint odours that came from the forest, there came a whole universe of suggestion, a gay and motley train of rhapsodical and immethodical thought. Busied in this, I walked on for several hours, during which the mist deepened around me to so great an extent that at length I was reduced to an absolute groping of the way. And now an indescribable uneasiness possessed me, a species of nervous hesitation and tremor. I feared to tread, lest I should be precipitated into some abyss. I remembered, too, strange stories told about these ragged hills, and of the uncouth and fierce races of men who tenanted their groves and caverns. A thousand vague fancies oppressed and disconcerted me, fancies the more distressing because vague. Very suddenly my attention was arrested by the loud beating of a drum. My amazement was, of course, extreme. A drum in these hills was a thing unknown. I could not have been more surprised at the sound of the trump of the archangel. But a new and still more astounding source of interest and perplexity arose. There came a wild rattling or jingling sound, as if of a bunch of large keys, and upon the instant a dusky-visaged and half-naked man rushed past me with a shriek. He came so close to my person that I felt his hot breath upon my face. He bore in one hand an instrument composed of an assemblage of steel rings, and shook them vigorously as he ran. Scarcely had he disappeared in the mist before, panting after him with open mouth and glaring eyes, there darted a huge beast. I could not be mistaken in its character. It was a hyena. The sight of this monster rather relieved than heightened my terrors, for I now made sure that I dreamed, and endeavored to arouse myself to waking consciousness. I stepped boldly and briskly forward. I rubbed my eyes. I called aloud. I pinched my limbs. A small spring of water presented itself to my view, and here, stooping, I bathed my hands and my head and neck. This seemed to dissipate the equivocal sensations which had hitherto annoyed me. I arose, as I thought, a new man, and proceeded steadily and complacently on my unknown way. At length, quite overcome by exertion and by a certain oppressive closeness of the atmosphere, I seated myself beneath a tree. Presently there came a feeble gleam of sunshine, and the shadow of the leaves of the tree fell faintly but definitely upon the grass. At this shadow I gazed wonderingly for many minutes. Its character stupefied me with astonishment. I looked upward. The tree was a palm. I now arose hurriedly, and in a state of fearful agitation, for the fancy that I dreamed would serve me no longer. I felt that I had perfect command of my senses, and these senses now brought to my soul a world of novel and singular sensation. The heat became all at once intolerable. A strange odor loaded the breeze. A low continuous murmur, like that arising from a full but gently flowing river, came to my ears, intermingled with the peculiar hum of multitudinous human voices. While I listened in an extremity of astonishment which I need not attempt to describe, a strong and brief gust of wind bore off the incumbent fog as if by the wand of an enchanter. I found myself at the foot of a high mountain, and looking down into a vast plain through which wound a majestic river. On the margin of the river stood an eastern-looking city, such as we read of in the Arabian tales, but of a character even more singular than any there described. From my position, which was far above the level of the town, I could perceive its every nook and corner, as if delineated on a map. The streets seemed innumerable, and crossed each other irregularly in all directions, but were rather long winding alleys than streets, and absolutely swarmed with inhabitants. The houses were wildly picturesque. On every hand was a wilderness of balconies, of verandas, of minarets, of shrines, and fantastically carved oriels. Bazaars abounded, and in these were displayed rich wares in infinite variety and profusion, silks, muslins, the most dazzled cutlery, the most magnificent jewels and gems. Besides these things were seen on all sides banners and palanquins, litters with stately dames close-veiled, elephants gorgeously caparisoned, idols grotesquely hewn, drums, banners and gongs, spears, silver and gilded maces. And amid the crowd and the clamour and the general intricacy and confusion, amid the million of black and yellow men turbaned and robed, and of flowing beard, there roamed a countless multitude of holy filleted bulls, while vast legions of the filthy but sacred ape clambered, chattering and shrieking, about the cornices of the mosques, or clung to the minarets and oriels. From the swarming streets to the banks of the river there descended innumerable flights of steps leading to bathing places, while the river itself seemed to force a passage with difficulty through the vast fleets of deeply burthened ships that far and wide encountered its surface. Beyond the limits of the city arose in frequent majestic groups the palm and the cocoa, with other gigantic and weird trees of vast age, and here and there might be seen a field of rice, the thatched hut of a peasant, a tank, a stray temple, a gypsy camp, or a solitary graceful maiden taking her way, with a pitcher upon her head, to the banks of the magnificent river. You will say now, of course, that I dreamed, but not so. What I saw, what I heard, what I felt, what I thought, had about it nothing of the unmistakable idiosyncrasy of the dream. All was rigorously self-consistent. At first, doubting that I was really awake, I entered into a series of tests, which soon convinced me that I really was. Now, when one dreams, and in the dream suspects that he dreams, the suspicion never fails to confirm itself, and the sleeper is almost immediately aroused. Thus Novalis errs not in saying that we are near waking when we dream that we dream. Had the vision occurred to me as I describe it, without my suspecting it as a dream, then a dream it might absolutely have been, but occurring as it did, and suspected and tested as it was, I am forced to class it among other phenomena. In this I am not sure that you are wrong, observed Dr. Templeton, but proceed. You arose and descended into the city. I arose, continued Bedloe, regarding the doctor with an air of profound astonishment. I arose, as you say, and descended into the city. On my way I fell in with an immense populace, crowding through every avenue, all in the same direction, and exhibiting in every action the wildest excitement. Very suddenly, and by some inconceivable impulse, I became intensely imbued with personal interest in what was going on. I seemed to feel that I had an important part to play, without exactly understanding what it was. Against the crowd which environed me, however, I experienced a deep sentiment of animosity. I shrank from amid them, and swiftly, by a circuitous path, reached and entered the city. Here all was the wildest tumult and contention. A small party of men, clad in garments half Indian, half European, and officered by gentlemen in a uniformly partly British, were engaged at great odds with the swarming rabble of the alleys. I joined the weaker party, arming myself with the weapons of a fallen officer, and fighting I knew not whom with the nervous ferocity of despair. We were soon overpowered by numbers, and driven to seek refuge in a species of kiosk. Here we barricaded ourselves, and for the present were secure. From a loophole near the summit of the kiosk, I perceived a vast crowd in furious agitation, surrounding and assaulting a gay palace that overhung the river. Presently, from an upper window of this place, there descended an effeminate-looking person by means of a string made of the turbans of his attendants. A boat was at hand, in which he escaped to the opposite bank of the river. And now a new object took possession of my soul. I spoke a few hurried but energetic words to my companions, and having succeeded in gaining over a few of them to my purpose, made a frantic sally from the kiosk. We rushed amid the crowd that surrounded it. They retreated, at first, before us. They rallied, fought madly, and retreated again. In the meantime, we were borne far from the kiosk, and became bewildered and entangled among the narrow streets of tall, overhanging houses, into the recesses of which the sun had never been able to shine. The rabble pressed impetuously upon us, harassing us with their spears, and overwhelming us with flights of arrows. These latter were very remarkable, and resembled in some respects to the writhing cries of the Malay. They were made to imitate the body of a creeping serpent, and were long and black, with a poisoned barb. One of them struck me upon the right temple. I reeled and fell, and instantaneously a dreadful sickness seized me. I struggled. I gasped. I died. "You will hardly persist now," said I, smiling, "that the whole of your adventure was not a dream. You are not prepared to maintain that you are dead?" When I said these words, I of course expected some lively sally from Bedloe in reply, but, to my astonishment, he hesitated, trembled, became fearfully pallid, and remained silent. I looked toward Templeton. He sat erect and rigid in his chair. His teeth chattered, and his eyes were starting from their sockets. "Proceed," he at length said hoarsely to Bedloe. "For many minutes," continued the latter, "my sole sentiment, my sole feeling, was that of darkness and nonentity, with the consciousness of death. At length there seemed to pass a violent and sudden shock through my soul, as if of electricity. With it came the sense of elasticity and of light. This latter I felt, not saw. In an instant I seemed to rise from the ground. But I had no bodily, no visible, audible, or palpable presence. The crowd had departed. The tumult had ceased. The city was in comparative repose. Beneath me lay my corpse, with the arrow in my temple, the whole head greatly swollen and disfigured. But all these things I felt, not saw. I took interest in nothing. Even the corpse seemed a matter in which I had no concern. Volition I had none, but appeared to be impelled into motion and flitted buoyantly out of the city, retracing the circuitous path by which I had entered it. When I had attained that point of the ravine in the mountains at which I had encountered the hyena, I again experienced a shock as of a galvanic battery. The sense of weight, of volition, of substance returned. I became my original self and bent my steps eagerly homeward. But for the past had not lost the vividness of the real, and for now, even for an instant, can I compel my understanding to regard it as a dream. "Nor was it," said Templeton, with an air of deep solemnity. "Yet it would be difficult to say how otherwise it should be termed. Let us suppose only that the soul of the man of today is upon the verge of some stupendous psychical discoveries. Let us content ourselves with this supposition. For the rest, I have some explanation to make. Here is a watercolor drawing which I should have shown you before, but which an unaccountable sentiment of horror has hitherto prevented me from showing." We looked at the picture which he presented. I saw nothing in it of an extraordinary character, but its effect upon Bedloe was prodigious. He nearly fainted as he gazed, and yet it was but a miniature portrait, a miraculously accurate one, to be sure, of his own very remarkable features. At least this was my thought as I regarded it. "You will perceive," said Templeton, "the date of this picture. It is here, scarcely visible, in this corner, 1780. In this year was the portrait taken. It is the likeness of a dead friend, a Mr. Oldeb, to whom I became much attached at Calcutta during the administration of Warren Hastings. I was then only 20 years old. When I first saw you, Mr. Bedloe, at Saratoga, it was the miraculous similarity which existed between yourself and the painting which induced me to accost you, to seek your friendship, and to bring about those arrangements which resulted in my becoming your constant companion. In accompanying this point, I was urged partly, and perhaps principally, by a regretful memory of the deceased, but also, in part, by an uneasy, and not altogether horrorless curiosity respecting yourself. In your detail of the vision which presented itself to you amid the hills, you have described with the minutest accuracy the Indian city of Benares upon the Holy River. The riots, the combat, the massacre were the actual events of the insurrection of the Chaite Singh, which took place in 1780, when Hastings was put in imminent peril of his life. The man escaping by the string of turbans was Chaite Singh himself. The party in the kiosk were sepoys and British officers, headed by Hastings. Of this party I was one, and did all I could to prevent the rash and fatal sally of the officer who fell in the crowded alleys by the poisoned arrow of a Bengali. That officer was my dearest friend. It was Oldeb. You will perceive by these manuscripts. Here the speaker produced a notebook, in which several pages appeared to have been freshly written, that, at the very period in which you fancied these things amid the hills, I was engaged in detailing them upon paper here at home. In about a week after this conversation, the following paragraphs appeared in a Charlottesville paper. "We have the painful duty of announcing the death of Mr. Augustus Bedloe, a gentleman whose amiable manners and many virtues have long endeared him to the citizens of Charlottesville. Mr. B. for some years past has been subject to neuralgia, which has often threatened to terminate fatally, but this can be regarded only as the mediate cause of his decease. The proximate cause was one of special singularity. In an excursion to the Ragged Mountains a few days since, a slight cold and fever were contracted, attended with great determination of blood to the head. To relieve this, Dr. Templeton resorted to topical bleeding. Leeches were applied to the temples. In a fearfully brief period the patient died, when it appeared that in the jar containing the leeches had been introduced by accident one of the venomous vermicular sanctuaries which are now and then found in the neighboring ponds. This creature fastened itself upon a small artery in the right temple. Its close resemblance to the medicinal leech caused the mistake to be overlooked until too late. N.B. The poisonous sanctuary of Charlottesville may always be distinguished from the medicinal leech by its blackness, and especially by its writhing or vermicular motions, which very nearly resemble those of a snake. I was speaking with the editor of the paper in question upon the topic of this remarkable accident, when it occurred to me to ask how it happened that the name of the deceased had been given as Bedloe. "I presume," I said, "you have authority for the spelling, but I have always supposed the name to be written with an E at the end." "Authority? No," he replied. "It is a mere typographical error. The name is Bedloe with an E all the world over, and I never knew it to be spelt otherwise in my life." "Then," said I mutteringly as I turned upon my heel, "then indeed has it come to pass that one truth is stranger than any fiction, for Bedloe without the E, what is it but Old Eb conversed? And this man tells me that it is a typographical error."
The Torture of Hope by Villa Dalila Adom. Many years ago, as evening was closing in, the venerable Pedro Arbuez de Spila, sixth prior of the Dominicans of Segovia and third Grand Inquisitor of Spain, followed by a Fra Redemptor and preceded by two familiars of the Holy Office, the latter carrying lanterns, made their way to a subterranean dungeon. The bolt of a massive door creaked, and they entered a mephitic in pace, where the dim light revealed, between rings fastened to the wall, a blood-stained rack, a brazier, and a jug. On a pile of straw, loaded with fetters and his neck encircled by an iron carcan, sat a haggard man of uncertain age, clothed in rags. This prisoner was no other than Rabbi Osner Abarbanel, a Jew of Aragon, who, accused of usury and pitiless scorn for the poor, had been daily subjected to torture for more than a year. Yet, quote, his blindness was as dense as his hide, and he refused to abjure his faith. Proud of affiliation dating back thousands of years, proud of his ancestors, for all Jews worthy of the name are vain of their blood, he descended Talmudically from Athoniel and consequently from Ipsiboa, the wife of the last judge of Israel, a circumstance which had sustained his courage amid incessant torture. With tears in his eyes at the thought of this resolute soul rejecting salvation, the venerable Pedro Arbuez de Spila, approaching the shuddering rabbi, addressed him as follows: "My son, rejoice. Your trials here below are about to end. If in the presence of such obstinacy I was forced to permit, with deep regret, the use of great severity, my task of fraternal correction has its limits. You are the fig tree which, having failed so many times to bear fruit, at last withered, but God alone can judge your soul. Perhaps infinite mercy will shine upon you at the last moment. We must hope so. There are examples. So sleep in peace tonight. Tomorrow you will be included in the auto da fe, that is, you will be exposed to the quemadero, the symbolical flames of the everlasting fire. It burns, as you know, only at a distance, my son, and death is at least 2 hours, often 3, in coming, on account of the wet, iced bandages with which we protect the heads and hearts of the condemned. There will be 43 of you. Placed in the last row, you will have time to invoke God and to offer him this baptism of fire, which is of the Holy Spirit. Hope in the light, and rest." With these words, having signed to his companions to unchain the prisoner, the prior tenderly embraced him. Then came the turn of the Fra Redemptor, who, in a low tone, entreated the Jew's forgiveness for what he had made him suffer for the purpose of redeeming him. Then the two familiars silently kissed him. This ceremony over, the captive was left solitary and bewildered in the darkness. Rabbi Aser Abarbanel, with parched lips and visage worn by suffering, at first gazed at the closed door with vacant eyes. Closed? The word unconsciously roused a vague fancy in his mind, the fancy that he had seen for an instant the light of the lanterns through a chink between the door and the wall. A morbid idea of hope, due to the weakness of his brain, stirred his whole being. He dragged himself toward the strange appearance. Then, very gently and cautiously, slipping one finger into the crevice, he drew the door toward him. Marvelous! By an extraordinary accident, the familiar who closed it had turned the huge key an instant before it struck the stone casing, so that the rusty bolt not having entered the hole, the door again rolled on its hinges. The rabbi ventured to glance outside. By the aid of a sort of luminous dusk, he distinguished at first a semicircle of walls indented by winding stairs, and opposite to him, at the top of 5 or 6 stone steps, a sort of black portal opening into an immense corridor, whose first arches only were visible from below. Stretching himself flat, he crept to the threshold. Yes, it was really a corridor, but endless in length. A wan light illumined it. Lamps suspended from the vaulted ceiling lightened at intervals the dull hue of the atmosphere. The distance was veiled in shadow. Not a single door appeared in the whole extent. Only on one side, the left, heavily grated loopholes sunk in the walls admitted a light which must be that of evening, for crimson bars at intervals rested on the flags of the pavement. What a terrible silence! Yet yonder, at the far end of that passage, there might be a doorway of escape. The Jew's vacillating hope was tenacious, for it was the last. Without hesitating, he ventured on the flags, keeping close under the loopholes, trying to make himself part of the blackness of the long walls. He advanced slowly, dragging himself along on his breast, forcing back the cry of pain when some raw wound sent a keen pang through his whole body. Suddenly the sound of a sandaled foot approaching reached his ears. He trembled violently. Fear stifled him. His sight grew dim. Well, it was over, no doubt. He pressed himself into a niche and, half lifeless with terror, waited. It was a familiar hurrying along. He passed swiftly by, holding in his clenched hand an instrument of torture, a frightful figure, and vanished. The suspense which the rabbi had endured seemed to have suspended the functions of life, and he lay nearly an hour, unable to move. Fearing an increase of tortures if he were captured, he thought of returning to his dungeon. But the old hope whispered in his soul, that divine perhaps, which comforts us in our sorest trials. A miracle had happened. He could doubt no longer. He began to crawl toward the chance of escape. Exhausted by suffering and hunger, trembling with pain, he pressed onward. The sepulchral corridor seemed to lengthen mysteriously, while he, still advancing, gazed into the gloom where there must be some avenue of escape. Oh, oh! He again heard footsteps, but this time they were slower, more heavy. The white and black forms of 2 inquisitors appeared, emerging from the obscurity beyond. They were conversing in low tones, and seemed to be discussing some important subject, for they were gesticulating vehemently. At this spectacle Rabbi Aser Abarbanel closed his eyes. His heart beat so violently that it almost suffocated him. His rags were damp with the cold sweat of agony. He lay motionless by the wall, his mouth wide open under the rays of a lamp, praying to the God of David. Just opposite to him the 2 inquisitors paused under the light of the lamp, doubtless owing to some accident due to the course of their argument. One, while listening to his companion, gazed at the rabbi, and beneath that look, whose absence of expression the hapless man did not at first notice, he fancied he again felt the burning pincers scorch his flesh. He was to be once more a living wound. Fainting, breathless, with fluttering eyelids, He shivered at the touch of the monk's floating robe. But strange yet natural fact, the Inquisitor's gaze was evidently that of a man deeply absorbed in his intended reply, engrossed by what he was hearing. His eyes were fixed, and seemed to look at the Jew without seeing him. In fact, after the lapse of a few minutes, the two gloomy figures slowly pursued their way, still conversing in low tones, toward the place whence the prisoner had come. He had not been seen. Amid the horrible confusion of the rabbi's thoughts, the idea darted through his brain. Can I be already dead, that they did not see me? A hideous impression roused him from his lethargy, and looking at the wall against which his face was pressed, he imagined he beheld two fierce eyes watching him. He flung his head back in a sudden frenzy of fright, his hair fairly bristling. Yet no. His hand groped over the stones. It was the reflection of the Inquisitor's eyes, still retained in his own, which had been reflected from two spots on the wall. Forward. He must hasten toward that goal which he fancied, absurdly no doubt, to be deliverance, toward the darkness from which he was now barely 30 paces distant. He pressed forward faster on his knees, his hands at full length, dragging himself painfully along, and soon entered the dark portion of this terrible corridor. Suddenly the poor wretch felt a gust of cold air on the hands resting upon the flags. It came from under the little door to which the two walls led. Oh, heaven, if that door should open outward! Every nerve in the miserable fugitive's body thrilled with hope. He examined it from top to bottom, though scarcely able to distinguish its outlines in the surrounding darkness. He passed his hand over it. No bolt, no lock. A latch. He started up. The latch yielded to the pressure of his thumb. The door silently swung open before him. "Hallelujah," murmured the rabbi in a transport of gratitude as, standing on the threshold, he beheld the scene before him. The door had opened into the gardens, above which arched a starlit sky, into spring, liberty, life. It revealed the neighboring fields stretching toward the Sierras, whose sinuous blue lines were relieved against the horizon. Yonder lay freedom. Oh, to escape! He would journey all night through the lemon groves whose fragrance reached him. Once in the mountains, and he was safe. He inhaled the delicious air. The breeze revived him. His lungs expanded. He felt in his swelling heart the viniferace of Lazarus. And to thank once more the God who had bestowed this mercy upon him, he extended his arms, raising his eyes toward heaven. It was an ecstasy of joy. Then he fancied he saw the shadow of his arms approach him, fancied that he felt these shadowy arms enclose, embrace him, and that he was pressed tenderly to someone's breast. A tall figure actually did stand directly before him. He lowered his eyes and remained motionless, gasping for breath, dazed with fixed eyes, fairly driveling with terror. Horror! He was in the clasp of the Grand Inquisitor himself, the venerable Pedro Arbuez de Spila, who gazed at him with tearful eyes, like a good shepherd who had found his stray lamb. The dark-robed priest pressed the hapless Jew to his heart with so fervent an outburst of love that the edge of the monocle haircloth rubbed the Dominican's breast. And while Acer Abarbanel, with protruding eyes, gasped in agony in the ascetic's embrace, vaguely comprehending that all the phases of this fateful evening were only a prearranged torture, that of hope, the Grand Inquisitor, with an accent of touching reproach and a look of consternation, murmured in his ear, his breath parched and burning from long fasting. "What, my son? On the eve, perchance, of salvation, you wished to leave us?"
The Devil. The peasant and the doctor stood on opposite sides of the bed, beside the old dying woman. She was calm and resigned, and her mind quite clear, as she looked at them and listened to their conversation. She was going to die, and she did not rebel at it, for her time was come. She was 92. The July sun streamed in at the window and the open door and cast its hot flames on the uneven brown clay floor, which had been stamped down by 4 generations of clodhoppers. The smell of the fields came in also, driven by the sharp wind and parched by the noontide heat. The grasshoppers chirped themselves hoarse, and filled the country with their shrill noise, which was like that of the wooden toys which are sold to children at fair time. The doctor raised his voice and said, "Honor, you cannot leave your mother in this state. She may die at any moment." And the peasant, in great distress, replied, "But I must get in my wheat, for it has been lying on the ground a long time, and the weather is just right for it." "What do you say about it, mother?" And the dying old woman, still tormented by her Norman avariciousness, replied yes with her eyes and her forehead, and thus urged her son to get in his wheat and to leave her to die alone. But the doctor got angry, and stamping his foot, he said, "You are no better than a brute, do you hear? And I will not allow you to do it, do you understand? And if you must get in your wheat today, go and fetch Rapet's wife and make her look after your mother. I will have it, do you understand me? And if you do not obey me, I will let you die like a dog when you are ill in your turn, do you hear?" The peasant, a tall, thin fellow, with slow movements, who was tormented by indecision, by his fear of the doctor and his fierce love of saving, hesitated, calculated, and stammered out, "How much does La Rapet charge for attending sick people?" "How should I know?" the doctor cried. "That depends on how long she is needed." "Settle it with her, by heaven! But I want her to be here within an hour, do you hear?" So the man decided. "I will go for her," he replied. "Don't get angry, doctor." And the latter left, calling out as he went, "Be careful, be very careful, you know, for I do not joke when I am angry." As soon as they were alone, the peasant turned to his mother and said in a resigned voice, "I will go and fetch La Rapet, as the man will have it. Don't worry till I get back." And he went out in his turn. La Rapet, who was an old washerwoman, watched the dead and the dying of the neighborhood, and then, as soon as she had sewn her customers into that linen cloth from which they would emerge no more, she went and took up her iron to smooth out the linen of the living. Wrinkled like a last year's apple, spiteful, envious, avaricious with a phenomenal avarice, bent double, as if she had been broken in half across the loins by the constant motion of passing the iron over the linen, one might have said that she had a kind of abnormal and cynical love of a death struggle. She never spoke of anything but of the people she had seen die, of the various kinds of deaths at which she had been present, and she related with the greatest minuteness details which were always similar, just as a sportsman recounts his luck. When Honor Bontemps entered her cottage, he found her preparing the starch for the collars of the women villagers, and he said, "Good evening. I hope you are pretty well, Mother Rapet." She turned her head round to look at him and said, as usual, as usual. And you?" "Oh, as for me, I am as well as I could wish, but my mother is not well." "Your mother?" "Yes, my mother." "What is the matter with her?" "She is going to turn up her toes. That's what's the matter with her." The old woman took her hands out of the water and asked with sudden sympathy, "Is she as bad as all that?" "The doctor says she will not last till morning." "And she certainly is very bad." Honor hesitated, for he wanted to make a few preparatory remarks before coming to his proposition, but as he could hit upon nothing, he made up his mind suddenly. "How much will you ask to stay with her till the end? You know that I am not rich, and I cannot even afford to keep a servant girl. It is just that which has brought my poor mother to this state, too much worry and fatigue. She did the work of 10 in spite of her 92 years. We don't find any made of that stuff nowadays." La Rapet answered gravely, "There are two prices, 40 sous by day and 3 francs by night for the rich, and 20 sous by day and 40 by night for the others. You shall pay me the 20 and 40. But the peasant reflected, for he knew his mother well. He knew how tenacious of life, how vigorous and unyielding she was, and she might last another week, in spite of the doctor's opinion. And so he said resolutely, "No, I would rather you fix a price for the whole time until the end. I will take my chance one way or the other. The doctor says she will die very soon. If that happens, so much the better for you, and so much the worse for her. But if she holds out till tomorrow or longer, so much the better for her, and so much the worse for you." The nurse looked at the man in astonishment, for she had never treated a death as a speculation, and she hesitated, tempted by the idea of the possible gain. But she suspected that he wanted to play her a trick. "I can say nothing until I have seen your mother," she replied. "Then come with me and see her." She washed her hands and went with him immediately. They did not speak on the road. She walked with short, hasty steps, while he strode on with his long legs as if he were crossing a brook at every step. The cows lying down in the fields, overcome by the heat, raised their heads heavily and lowed feebly at the two passers-by, as if to ask them for some green grass. When they got near the house, Honore Bontemps murmured, "Suppose it is all over," and his unconscious wish that it might be so showed itself in the sound of his voice. But the old woman was not dead. She was lying on her back, on her wretched bed, her hands covered with a purple cotton counterpane, horribly thin, knotty hands like the claws of strange animals, like crabs, half closed by rheumatism, fatigue, and the work of nearly a century which she had accomplished. La Rapet went up to the bed and looked at the dying woman, felt her pulse, tapped her on the chest, listened to her breathing, and asked her questions, so as to hear her speak. And then, having looked at her for some time, she went out of the room, followed by Honore. Her decided opinion was that the old woman would not last till night. He asked, "Well?" And the sick nurse replied, "Well, she may last 2 days, perhaps 3. You will have to give me 6 francs, everything included." "6 francs? 6 francs?" he shouted. "Are you out of your mind? I tell you she cannot last more than 5 or 6 hours." And they disputed angrily for some time. But as the nurse said she must go home, as the time was going by, and as his wheat would not come to the farmyard of its own accord, he finally agreed to her terms. "Very well, then, that is settled. 6 francs, including everything, until the corpse is taken out." And he went away, with long strides, to his wheat which was lying on the ground under the hot sun which ripens the grain, while the sick nurse went in again to the house. She had brought some work with her, for she worked without ceasing by the side of the dead and dying, sometimes for herself, sometimes for the family which employed her as seamstress and paid her rather more in that capacity. Suddenly she asked, "Have you received the last sacraments, Mother Bontemps?" The old peasant woman shook her head, and La Rapet, who was very devout, got up quickly. "Good heavens, is it possible? I will go and fetch the curé." And she rushed off to the parsonage so quickly that the urchins in the street thought some accident had happened when they saw her running. The priest came immediately in his surplice, preceded by a choir boy who rang a bell to announce the passage of the host through the parched and quiet country. Some men who were working at a distance took off their large hats and remained motionless until the white vestment had disappeared behind some farm buildings. The women who were making up the sheaves stood up to make the sign of the cross. The frightened black hens ran away along the ditch until they reached a well-known hole, through which they suddenly disappeared. while a foal which was tied in the meadow took fright at the sight of the surplice and began to gallop round and round, kicking out every now and then. The acolyte, in his red cassock, walked quickly, and the priest, with his head inclined toward one shoulder and his square biretta on his head, followed him, muttering some prayers, while last of all came La Rapet, bent almost double as if she wished to prostrate herself as she walked with the folded hands as they do in church. Honore saw them pass in the distance, and he asked, "Where is the priest going?" His man, who was more intelligent, replied, "He is taking the sacrament to your mother, of course." The peasant was not surprised, and said, "That may be," and went on with his work. Mother Bontemps confessed, received absolution and communion, and the priest took his departure, leaving the two women alone in the suffocating room, while La Rapet began to look at the dying woman and to ask herself whether it could last much longer. The day was on the wane, and gusts of cooler air began to blow, causing a view of Epinal, which was fastened to the wall by two pins, to flap up and down. The scanty window curtains, which had formerly been white, but were now yellow and covered with fly specks, looked as if they were going to fly off, as if they were struggling to get away, like the old woman's soul. Lying motionless, with her eyes open, she seemed to await with indifference that death which was so near and which yet delayed its coming. Her short breathing whistled in her constricted throat. It would stop altogether soon, and there would be one woman less in the world. No one would regret her. At nightfall Honore returned, and when he went up to the bed and saw that his mother was still alive, he asked, "How is she?" just as he had done formerly, when she had been ailing, and then he sent La Rapet away, saying to her, "Tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock without fail." And she replied, "Tomorrow at 5 o'clock." She came at daybreak, and found Honore eating his soup, which he had made himself before going to work, and the sick nurse asked him, "Well, is your mother dead?" "She is rather better, on the contrary," he replied, with a sly look out of the corner of his eyes, and he went out. La Rapet, seized with anxiety, went up to the dying woman, who remained in the same state, lethargic and impassive, with her eyes open and her hands clutching the counterpane. The nurse perceived that this might go on thus for 2 days, 4 days, 8 days, and her avaricious mind was seized with fear, while she was furious at the sly fellow who had tricked her, and at the woman who would not die. Nevertheless, she began to work, and waited, looking intently at the wrinkled face of Mother Bontemps. When Honore returned to breakfast, he seemed quite satisfied, and even in a bantering humour. He was decidedly getting in his wheat under very favourable circumstances. La Rapet was becoming exasperated. Every minute now seemed to her so much time and money stolen from her. She felt a mad inclination to take this old woman, this headstrong old fool, this obstinate old wretch, and to stop that short rapid breath which was robbing her of her time and money by squeezing her throat a little. But then she reflected on the danger of doing so, and other thoughts came into her head. So she went up to the bed and said, "Have you ever seen the devil?" Mother Bontemps murmured, "No." Then the sick nurse began to talk, and to tell her tales which were likely to terrify the weak mind of the dying woman. "Some minutes before one dies, the devil appears," she said, "to all who are in the death throes. He has a broom in his hand, a saucepan on his head, and he utters loud cries. When anybody sees him, all is over, and that person has only a few moments longer to live." She then enumerated all those to whom the devil had appeared that year: Josephine, Loisel, Eulalie Ratier, Sophie Palancneau, Séraphine Grospierre. Mother Bontemps, who had at last become disturbed in mind, moved about, wrung her hands, and tried to turn her head to look toward the end of the room. Suddenly La Rapet disappeared at the foot of the bed. She took a sheet out of the cupboard and wrapped herself up in it. She put the iron saucepan on her head, so that its 3 short bent feet rose up like horns, and she took a broom in her right hand and a tin pail in her left, which she threw up suddenly so that it might fall to the ground noisily. When it came down, it certainly made a terrible noise. Then, climbing upon a chair, the nurse lifted up the curtain which hung at the bottom of the bed, and showed herself gesticulating and uttering shrill cries into the iron saucepan which covered her face, while she menaced the old peasant woman, who was nearly dead, with her broom. Terrified, with an insane expression on her face, the dying woman made a superhuman effort to get up and escape. She even got her shoulders and chest out of bed. Then she fell back with a deep sigh. All was over, and La Rapet calmly put everything back into its place. The broom into the corner by the cupboard, the sheet inside it, the saucepan on the hearth, the pail on the floor, and the chair against the wall. Then, with professional movements, she closed the dead woman's large eyes, put a plate on the bed, and poured some holy water into it, placing in it the twig of boxwood that had been nailed to the chest of drawers, and kneeling down, she fervently repeated the prayers for the dead, which she knew by heart, as a matter of business. And when Honore returned in the evening, he found her praying, and he calculated immediately that she had made 20 sous out of him, for she had only spent 3 days and 1 night there, which made 5 francs altogether, instead of the 6 which he owed her.
Who knows? By Guy de Maupassant. My God, I'm going to write down at last what has happened to me. But how can I? How dare I? The thing is so bizarre, so inexplicable, so incomprehensible, so silly. If I were not perfectly sure of what I've seen, sure that there was not in my reasoning any defect, any error in my declarations, any lacuna in the inflexible sequence of my observations, I should believe myself to be the dupe of a simple hallucination, the sport of a singular vision. After all, who knows? Yesterday, I was in a private asylum, but I went there voluntarily out of prudence and fear. Only one single human being knows my history, and that is the doctor of the said asylum. I am going to write to him. I really do not know why. To disembarrass myself? Yea, I feel as though weighed down by an intolerable nightmare. Let me explain. I have always been a recluse, a dreamer, a kind of isolated philosopher, easy-going, content with but little, harboring ill feeling against no man, and without even a grudge against heaven. I have constantly lived alone. Consequently, a kind of torture takes hold of me when I find myself in the presence of others. How is this to be explained? I do not know. I am not averse to going out into the world, to conversation, to dining with friends, but when they are near me for any length of time, even the most intimate of them, they bore me, fatigue me, enervate me, and I experience an overwhelming, torturing desire to see them get up and go, to take themselves away and to leave me by myself. That desire is more than a craving. It is an irresistible necessity, and if the presence of people with whom I find myself were to be continued, if I were compelled not only to listen, but also to follow for any length of time their conversation, a serious accident would assuredly take place. What kind of accident? Who knows? Perhaps a slight paralytic stroke? Probably. I like solitude so much that I cannot even endure the vicinage of other beings sleeping under the same roof. I cannot live in Paris, because there I suffer the most acute agony. I lead a moral life, and am therefore tortured in body and in nerves by that immense crowd which swarms and lives even when it sleeps. Ah! The sleeping of others is more painful still than their conversation, and I can never find repose when I know and feel that on the other side of a wall several existences are undergoing these regular eclipses of reason. Why am I thus? Who knows? The cause of it is very simple, perhaps. I get tired very soon of everything that does not emanate from me, and there are many people in similar case. We are, on earth, 2 distinct races. Those who have need of others, whom others amuse, engage, soothe, whom solitude harasses, pains, stupefies, like the movement of a terrible glacier or the traversing of the desert, and those, on the contrary, whom others weary, tire, bore, silently torture, whom isolation calms and bathes in the repose of independency, and plunges into the humours of their own thoughts. In fine, there is here a normal, physical phenomenon. Some are constituted to live a life outside of themselves, others to live a life within themselves. As for me, my exterior associations are abruptly and painfully short-lived, and, as they reach their limits, I experience in my whole body and in my whole intelligence an intolerable uneasiness. As a result of this, I became attached, or rather had become much attached, to inanimate objects, which have for me the importance of beings, and my house has, or had, become a world in which I lived an active and solitary life, surrounded by all manner of things, furniture, familiar knickknacks, as sympathetic in my eyes as the visages of human beings. I had filled my mansion with them. Little by little, I had adorned it with them, and I felt an inward content and satisfaction, was more happy than if I had been in the arms of a beloved girl, whose wonted caresses had become a soothing and delightful necessity. I had had this house constructed in the center of a beautiful garden, which hid it from the public highways, and which was near the entrance to a city where I could find, on occasion, the resources of society for which, at moments, I had a longing. All my domestics slept in a separate building, which was situated at some considerable distance from my house, at the far end of the kitchen garden, which in turn was surrounded by a high wall. The obscure envelopment of night, in the silence of my concealed habitation, buried under the leaves of great trees, was so reposeful and so delicious that before retiring to my couch I lingered every evening for several hours in order to enjoy the solitude a little longer. One day Signet had been playing at one of the city theaters. It was the first time that I had listened to that beautiful, musical, and fairy-like drama, and I had derived from it the liveliest pleasures. I returned home on foot with a light step, my head full of sonorous phrases, and my mind haunted by delightful visions. It was night, the dead of night, and so dark that I could hardly distinguish the broad highway, and consequently I stumbled into the ditch more than once. From the custom house, at the barriers, to my house, was about a mile, perhaps a little more, a leisurely walk of about 20 minutes. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, 1 o'clock or maybe 1:30. The sky had by this time cleared somewhat, and the crescent appeared, the gloomy crescent of the last quarter of the moon. The crescent of the first quarter is that which rises about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, and is clear, gay, and fretted with silver. But the one which rises after midnight is reddish, sad, and desolating. It is the true Sabbath crescent. Every prowler by night has made the same observation. The first, though slender as a thread, throws a faint, joyous light which rejoices the heart and lines the ground with distinct shadows. The last sheds hardly a dying glimmer, and is so wan that it occasions hardly any shadows. In the distance I perceived the sombre mass of my garden, and, I know not why, was seized with a feeling of uneasiness at the idea of going inside. I slackened my pace and walked very softly, the thick cluster of trees having the appearance of a tomb in which my house was buried. I opened my outer gate and entered the long avenue of sycamores which ran in the direction of the house, arranged vault-wise like a high tunnel, traversing opaque masses and winding round the turf lawns, on which baskets of flowers, in the pale darkness, could be indistinctly discerned. While approaching the house, I was seized by a strange feeling. I could hear nothing. I stood still. Through the trees there was not even a breath of air stirring. "What is the matter with me?" I said to myself. For 10 years I had entered and re-entered in the same way, without ever experiencing the least inquietude. I never had any fear at nights. The sight of a man, a marauder, or a thief would have thrown me into a fit of anger, and I would have rushed at him without any hesitation. Moreover, I was armed. I had my revolver. But I did not touch it, for I was anxious to resist that feeling of dread with which I was seized. What was it? Was it a presentiment? That mysterious presentiment which takes hold of the senses of men who have witnessed something which, to them, is inexplicable? Perhaps. Who knows? In proportion as I advanced, I felt my skin quiver more and more, and when I was close to the wall, near the outhouses of my large residence, I felt that it would be necessary for me to wait a few minutes before opening the door and going inside. I sat down, then, on a bench under the windows of my drawing-room. I rested there, a little disturbed, with my head leaning against the wall, my eyes wide open under the shade of the foliage. For the first few minutes, I did not observe anything unusual around me. I had a humming noise in my ears, but that has happened often to me. Sometimes it seemed to me that I heard trains passing, that I heard clocks striking, that I heard a multitude on the march. Very soon, those humming noises became more distinct, more concentrated, more determinable. I was deceiving myself. It was not the ordinary tingling of my arteries which transmitted to my ears these rumbling sounds, but it was a very distinct, though confused noise which came, without any doubt whatever, from the interior of my house. Through the walls I distinguished this continued noise. I should rather say agitation than noise, an indistinct moving about of a pile of things, as if people were tossing about, displacing, and carrying away surreptitiously all my furniture. I doubted, however, for some considerable time yet, the evidence of my ears. But having placed my ear against one of the outhouses, the better to discover what this strange disturbance was inside my house, I became convinced, certain, that something was taking place in my residence which was altogether abnormal and incomprehensible. I had no fear, but I was, how shall I express it? Paralyzed by astonishment. I did not draw my revolver, knowing very well that there was no need of my doing so. I listened a long time, but could come to no resolution, my mind being quite clear, though in myself I was naturally anxious. I got up and waited, listening always to the noise, which gradually increased and at intervals grew very loud, and which seemed to become an impatient, angry disturbance, a mysterious commotion. Then, suddenly, ashamed of my timidity, I seized my bunch of keys. I selected the one I wanted, guided it into the lock, turned it twice, and pushing the door with all my might, sent it banging against the partition. The collision sounded like the report of a gun, and there responded to that explosive noise, from roof to basement of my residence, a formidable tumult. It was so sudden, so terrible, so deafening, that I recoiled a few steps, and though I knew it to be wholly useless, I pulled my revolver out of its case. I continued to listen for some time longer. I could distinguish now an extraordinary pattering upon the steps of my grand staircase, on the waxed floors, on the carpets, not of boots, or of naked feet, but of iron and wooden crutches, which resounded like cymbals. Then I suddenly discerned, on the threshold of my door, an armchair, my large reading easy-chair, which set off, waddling. It went away through my garden. Others followed it, those of my drawing-room, then my sofas, dragging themselves along like crocodiles on their short paws. Then all my chairs, bounding like goats, and the little footstools, hopping like rabbits. Oh, what a sensation! I slunk back into a clump of bushes, where I remained crouched up, watching meanwhile my furniture defile past. For everything walked away, the one behind the other, briskly or slowly according to its weight or size. My piano, my grand piano, bounded past with the gallop of a horse and a murmur of music in its sides. The smaller articles slid along the gravel like snails. My brushes, crystal, cups, and saucers, which glistened in the moonlight. I saw my writing desk appear, a rare curiosity of the last century, which contained all the letters I had ever received, all the history of my heart, an old history from which I have suffered so much. Besides, there were inside of it a great many cherished photographs. Suddenly, I no longer had any fear. I threw myself on it, seized it as one would seize a thief, as one would seize a wife about to run away. But it pursued its irresistible course, and despite my efforts, and despite my anger, I could not even retard its pace. As I was resisting in desperation that insuperable force, I was thrown to the ground. It then rolled me over, trailed me along the gravel, and the rest of my furniture, which followed it, began to march over me, tramping on my legs and injuring them. When I loosed my hold, other articles had passed over my body, just as a charge of cavalry does over the body of a dismounted soldier. Seized at last with terror, I succeeded in dragging myself out of the main avenue, and in concealing myself again among the shrubbery, so as to watch the disappearance of the most cherished objects, the smallest, the least striking, the least unknown which had once belonged to me. I then heard, in the distance, noises which came from my apartments, which sounded now as if the house were empty, a loud noise of shutting of doors. They were being slammed from top to bottom of my dwelling, even the door which I had just opened myself unconsciously, and which had closed of itself when the last thing had taken its departure. I took flight also, running toward the city, and only regained my self-composure on reaching the boulevards where I met belated people. I rang the bell of a hotel where I was known. I had knocked the dust off my clothes with my hands, and I told the porter that I had lost my bunch of keys, which included also that to the kitchen garden, where my servants slept in a house standing by itself on the other side of the wall of the enclosure which protected my fruits and vegetables from the raids of marauders. I covered myself up to the eyes in the bed which was assigned to me, but could not sleep. And I waited for dawn, listening to the throbbing of my heart. I had given orders that my servants were to be summoned to the hotel at daybreak, and my valet de chambre knocked at my door at 7 o'clock in the morning. His countenance bore a woeful look. "A great misfortune has happened during the night, monsieur," said he. "What is it?" "Somebody has stolen the whole of monsieur's furniture. All. Everything, even to the smallest articles." This news pleased me. Why? Who knows? I was complete master of myself, bent on dissimulating, on telling no one of anything I had seen, determined on concealing and in burying in my heart of hearts a terrible secret. I responded, "They must then be the same people who have stolen my keys. The police must be informed immediately. I am going to get up, and I will join you in a few moments." The investigation into the circumstances under which the robbery might have been committed lasted for 5 months. Nothing was found, not even the smallest of my knickknacks, nor the least trace of the thieves. Good gracious! If I had only told them what I knew! If I had said, I should have been locked up. I, not the thieves, for I was the only person who had seen everything from the first. Yes, but I knew how to keep silence. I shall never refurnish my house. That were indeed useless. The same thing would happen again. I had no desire even to re-enter the house, and I did not re-enter it. I never visited it again. I moved to Paris, to the hotel, and consulted doctors in regard to the condition of my nerves, which had disquieted me a good deal ever since that awful night. They advised me to travel, and I followed their counsel. I began by making an excursion into Italy. The sunshine did me much good. For 6 months I wandered about from Genoa to Venice, from Venice to Florence, from Florence to Rome, from Rome to Naples. Then I traveled over Sicily, a country celebrated for its scenery and its monuments, relics left by the Greeks and the Normans. Passing over into Africa, I traversed at my ease that immense desert, yellow and tranquil, in which camels, gazelles, and Arab vagabonds roam about, where, in the rare and transparent atmosphere, there hover no vague hauntings, where there is never any night, but always day. I returned to France by Marseille, and in spite of all its provincial gaiety, the diminished clearness of the sky made me sad. I experienced, in returning to the continent, the peculiar sensation of an illness which I believed had been cured, and a dull pain which predicted that the seeds of the disease had not been eradicated. I then returned to Paris. At the end of a month, I was very dejected. It was in the autumn, and I determined to make, before winter came, an excursion through Normandy, a country with which I was unacquainted. I began my journey in the best of spirits at Rouen, and for 8 days I wandered about, passive, ravished, and enthusiastic in that ancient city, that astonishing museum of extraordinary Gothic monuments. But one afternoon, about 4 o'clock, as I was sauntering slowly through a seemingly unattractive street, by which there ran a stream as black as the ink, called Eau de Robec, my attention, fixed for the moment on the quaint, antique appearance of some of the houses, was suddenly attracted by the view of a series of second-hand furniture shops, which followed one another, door after door. Ah! They had carefully chosen their locality, these sordid traffickers in antiquities, in that quaint little street, overlooking the sinister stream of water, under those tile and slate-pointed roofs, on which still grinned the veins of bygone days. At the end of these grim storehouses you saw piled up sculptured chests, Rouen, Sèvres, and Moustier's pottery, painted statues, others of oak, Christs, virgins, saints, church ornaments, chasubles, capes, even sacred vases, and an old gilded wooden tabernacle, where a god had hidden himself away. What singular caverns there are in those lofty houses, crowded with objects of every description, where the existence of things seems to be ended. Things which had survived their original possessors, their century, their times, their fashions, in order to be bought as curiosities by new generations. My affection for antiques was awakened in that city of antiquaries. I went from shop to shop, crossing in 2 strides the rotten 4-plank bridges thrown over the nauseous current of the Eau de Robec. Heaven protect me! What a shock! At the end of a vault, which was crowded with articles of every description, and which seemed to be the entrance to the catacombs of a cemetery of ancient furniture, I suddenly descried one of my most beautiful wardrobes. I approached it, trembling in every limb, trembling to such an extent that I dared not touch it. I put forth my hand. I hesitated. Nevertheless, it was indeed my wardrobe, a unique wardrobe of the time of Louis XIII, recognizable by anyone who had seen it only once. Casting my eyes suddenly a little farther, toward the more somber depths of the gallery, I perceived 3 of my tapestry-covered chairs, and, farther on still, my 2 Henry II tables, such rare treasures that people came all the way from Paris to see them. Think! Only think in what state of mind I now was. I advanced, haltingly, quivering with emotion, but I advanced, for I am brave. I advanced like a knight of the Dark Ages. At every step I found something that belonged to me. My brushes, my books, my tables, my silks, my arms, everything except the bureau full of my letters, and that I could not discover. I walked on, descending to the dark galleries, in order to ascend next to the floors above. I was alone. I called out. Nobody answered. I was alone. There was no one in that house, a house as vast and tortuous as a labyrinth. Night came on, and I was compelled to sit down in the darkness on one of my own chairs, for I had no desire to go away. From time to time I shouted, "Hello! Hello! Somebody!" I had sat there, certainly, for more than an hour when I heard steps. Steps soft and slow. I knew not where. I was unable to locate them, but bracing myself up, I called out anew, whereupon I perceived a glimmer of light in the next chamber. "Who is there?" said a voice. "A buyer," I responded. "It is too late to enter thus into a shop." "I have been waiting for you for more than an hour," I answered. "You can come back tomorrow." "Tomorrow I must quit Rouen." I dared not advance, and he did not come to me. I saw always the glimmer of his light, which was shining on a tapestry on which were 2 angels flying over the dead on a field of battle. It belonged to me also. I said, "Well, come here." "I am at your service," he answered. I got up and went toward him. Standing in the center of a large room was a little man, very short and very fat. Phenomenally fat. A hideous phenomenon. He had a singular straggling beard, white and yellow, and not a hair on his head. Not a hair. As he held his candle aloft at arm's length in order to see me, his cranium appeared to me to resemble a little moon. in that vast chamber encumbered with old furniture. His features were wrinkled and blown, and his eyes could not be seen. I bought 3 chairs, which belonged to myself, and paid at once a large sum for them, giving him merely the number of my room at the hotel. They were to be delivered the next day before 9 o'clock. I then started off. He conducted me with much politeness as far as the door. I immediately repaired to the commissaire's office at the Central Police Depot and told the commissaire of the robbery which had been perpetrated and of the discovery I had just made. He required time to communicate by telegraph with the authorities who had originally charge of the case for information, and he begged me to wait in his office until an answer came back. An hour later, an answer came back which was in accord with my statements. "I am going to arrest and interrogate this man at once," he said to me, "for he may have conceived some sort of suspicion and smuggled away out of sight what belongs to you. Will you go and dine and return in 2 hours? I shall then have the man here, and I shall subject him to a fresh interrogation in your presence." "Most gladly, monsieur. I thank you with my whole heart." I went to dine at my hotel, and I ate better than I could have believed. I was quite happy now, thinking that man was in the hands of the police. 2 hours later, I returned to the office of the police functionary, who was waiting for me. "Well, monsieur," said he, on perceiving me, "we have not been able to find your man. My agents cannot put their hands on him." Ah, I felt my heart sinking. "But you have at least found his house?" I asked. "Yes, certainly. And what is more, it is now being watched and guarded until his return. As for him, he has disappeared." "Disappeared?" "Yes, disappeared. He ordinarily passes his evenings at the house of a female neighbor, who is also a furniture broker, a queer sort of sorceress, the widow Bidouin. She has not seen him this evening, and cannot give any information in regard to him. We must wait until tomorrow." I went away. Ah, how sinister the streets of Rouen seemed to me, now troubled and haunted. I slept so badly that I had a fit of nightmare every time I went off to sleep. As I did not wish to appear too restless or eager, I waited till 10 o'clock the next day before reporting myself to the police. The merchant had not reappeared. His shop remained closed. The commissary said to me, "I have taken all the necessary steps. The court has been made acquainted with the affair. We shall go together to that shop and have it opened, and you shall point out to me all that belongs to you." We drove there in a cab. Police agents were stationed round the building. There was a locksmith, too, and the door of the shop was soon opened. On entering, I could not discover my wardrobes, my chairs, my tables. I saw nothing of that which had furnished my house. No, nothing, although on the previous evening I could not take a step without encountering something that belonged to me. The chief commissary, much astonished, regarded me at first with suspicion. "My God, monsieur," said I to him, "the disappearance of these articles of furniture coincides strangely with that of the merchant." He laughed. "That is true. You did wrong in buying and paying for the articles which were your own property yesterday. It was that which gave him the cue." "What seems to me incomprehensible," I replied, "is that all the places that were occupied by my furniture are now filled by other furniture. Oh, responded the commissary, he has had all night, and has, no doubt, been assisted by accomplices. This house must communicate with its neighbors. But have no fear, monsieur. I will have the affair promptly and thoroughly investigated. The brigand shall not escape us for long, seeing that we are in charge of the den. Ah, my heart, my heart, my poor heart, how it beats. I remained a fortnight at Rouen. The man did not return. Heavens! Good heavens! That man! What was it that could have frightened and surprised him? But on the 16th day, early in the morning, I received from my gardener, now the keeper of my empty and pillaged house, the following strange letter. Monsieur, I have the honor to inform monsieur that something happened the evening before last, which nobody can understand, and the police no more than the rest of us. The whole of the furniture has been returned. Not one piece is missing. Everything is in its place, up to the very smallest article. The house is now the same in every respect as it was before the robbery took place. It is enough to make one lose one's head. The thing took place during the night Friday, Saturday. The roads are dug up as though the whole fence had been dragged from its place up to the door. The same thing was observed the day after the disappearance of the furniture. We are anxiously expecting monsieur, whose very humble and obedient servant I am, Philippe Rodet. Oh, no, no! Never, never! No, I shall never return there! I took the letter to the commissary of police. It is a very clever restitution, said he. Let us bury the hatchet. We shall nip the man one of these days. But he has never been nipped. No, they have not nipped him. And I am afraid of him now, as of some ferocious animal that has been let loose behind me. Inexplicable. It is inexplicable, this chimera of a moonstruck skull. We shall never solve or comprehend it. I shall not return to my former residence. What does it matter to me? I am afraid of encountering that man again, and I shall not run the risk. And even if he returns, if he takes possession of his shop, who is to prove that my furniture was on his premises? There is only my testimony against him, and I feel that it is not above suspicion. No. This kind of existence has become unendurable. I have not been able to guard the secret of what I have seen. I could not continue to live like the rest of the world, with the fear upon me that those scenes might be reenacted. So, I have come to consult the doctor who directs this lunatic asylum, and I have told him everything. After questioning me for a long time, he said to me, "Will you consent, monsieur, to remain here for some time?" "Most willingly, monsieur." "You have some means?" "Yes, monsieur." "Will you have isolated apartments?" "Yes, monsieur." "Would you care to receive any friends?" "No, monsieur. No. Nobody! The man from Rouen might take it into his head to pursue me here, to be revenged on me." I have been alone. Alone. All alone for 3 months. I am growing tranquil by degrees. I have no longer any fears. If the antiquary should become mad, And if he should be brought into this asylum, even prisons themselves are not places of security.